Mangwagway fi imang lumang gugupuisin Tumutunog iitan ko makati siren Man malalagu itaw tau ta paro panlihing Di amamunay mo iitay from Karen Mimilagi saduk mo na puitasi Podong ilansun manok kong tokela baboy Pat majetseng tungigi majasigi mangoti Itaw togisan halong para ufan libri Condition 3, condition 2 Enagwi un mogi pas pan malagu I-radio asangan gi condition 1 Head for higher grounds, you better run Kanya para lujan may gay na distrosu Kanya para kotan todo na biligro Kita si pues umalong kita inalahan Di jalan bulahan ng titias taasan Ipagitutuhan na matugin lagu Después gibira daw naginin na tatalu Mekay maninin yan mekay manlinay sen Sa ayong dansen fame and fuitsan na si Karen Condition 3, condition 2 Enagwi yung mag-i-pues man malaku I-radio asangan gi condition 1 Head for higher grounds, you better run Inanatanipat kun para ufalogu Igi maanay podong ineksi parehu Pues rebigwi man matay durang tiniira Sa iseblan ipagtukalan soblan kira Condition 3, condition 2 Enagwi umagi pues pan malogu I-radio asangan gi condition 1 Head for higher grounds, you better run Mas ni mahidisro sugi 100,000 pesos 90 kada siento na gumatay ato Sa hitatiman matay naon milagro Afanelos fan manay tay sa basta hipag to Basta hipag to Hey, basta hipag to
Hafade, Hamzu todos. Hafade. Inanhusi Michael Lujan Bevacqua. I am the curator at the Guam Museum, and this is the most recent episode of Faisen Guam Museum. And so, para Hamzuni Manyasaga Guinigi Islas Marianas, Puedia Mansasafo Hamzu. For those of you who are in the Marianas, I hope that you are all safe. We are just a few hours away from the island going into condition 1. And so the current typhoon that is facing our island is getting stronger and stronger. And it may potentially become a super typhoon when it hits later today or tomorrow. And so for those of you watching outside of the Marianas, we appreciate your support and your well wishes, your prayers, and so on. And so Faisen Guam Museum is something that was started by myself when I became the curator of the Guam Museum as a way of connecting people to the resources of the Guam Museum, the knowledge of the Guam Museum, and also just the knowledge that I have as well. And so what happens every episode of Faisen Guam Museum, Zan Estipogo Imina Dose. This is the 12th episode of Faisen Guam Museum. We started them, I started them when the museum was closed for the COVID pandemic. The Guam Museum was closed for about a year. People couldn't come and visit. And so when I started, I said, well, for those who can't come to the museum, let's solicit questions from our followers on social media, from the community. And then what I can do is at least do a live stream for 1 hour to talk to people, to answer questions that people have about Guam history, Marianas history, Chamorro language, culture, and history. And so today's episode might be a little bit short because as Estuhu mencionanay na umamalays na pagso, there is a storm that is approaching. And so esta manalistu shutters, the shutters have been prepared and we're just about ready. But still, there's always more that can be done in anticipation of these sorts of things. And so I have been sharing on the social media for the Guam Museum for the past few days, different images from storms in Mariana's history. And so hunggan man mesngun hit, munga hit na tafan malefa put no man mesngun hit. Lo hafa muna met good hit giestina class in situation I hiningetta inafa maulik tatagwanosya. All right, let's get started with Faisen Guam Museum. These are questions that were solicited via social media, via email and other forms. And so put fabot, if you have any questions for a future episode, feel free to leave them in the comments for this episode or send them to me via email, social media, or other forms. And so in addition to the typhoon this week, the Guam Museum is currently closed due to HVAC repairs. And so the air conditioning and the climate control in the museum has not been functioning, has been having lots of issues. And so we have been closing in order to protect the integrity of our artifacts, our exhibits. There are people who are working on it right now in terms of trying to assess and fix, but follow us on social media because that's where we will put the information as soon as there's a change in our status. But we apologize that the museum is currently closed. And so first question that we have, when did our people first stop speaking CHamoru? Was the language prohibited that they would stop speaking it? Again, and this is a question that's very important to me as somebody who has studied CHamoru language, taken up the learning of CHamoru language as an adult, and then continue to pass on the language to my children. And so this history of language suppression, it's important that we talk about it because we live with the impact of it. And so let's go back to before World War II in order to answer this question. The U.S. Navy governs the island. Historians call this the USS Guam period. And the U.S. Navy's track record at this time is they improve the island in some ways. They bring in infrastructure improvements, so like electricity and stuff like that. They open schools, and they're open for just about everybody. This was a shift compared to the Spanish, where schools definitely existed, but the education was not necessarily open to all, and a lot of it was religiously focused. The Navy, though, they create a healthcare system, but everything that they do is sort of influenced by the racism of the time. So, for example, the healthcare system that's created is motivated to clean up the CHaMorus because it's assumed that they're filthy and they're disease-ridden. And so we see that there's progress in many material ways, but at the same time, there's also sort of this suppression and these attacks on the CHaMoru people in terms of their identity, their language, and their culture. And so one of the things that happens is of course, that the CHaMoru language becomes banned in schools. The nature of this ban changes over time. At some moments over the 42-year period we're talking about, the CHaMoru language is aggressively being banned, as in there are clear restrictions and rules about how to punish children. At other times, it's not as closely followed. And so that's why, for example, there were some teachers, especially those who were further away from Hagatnya, the center of American power at that time, who would still use CHaMoru in the classroom with their students because that was the first language of their students. And so what motivated the United States in this regard, the U.S. Navy? This is from a article published in the Guam Recorder in Guam in 1928. English will bring to the people of Guam through the public schools a knowledge of sanitation and hygiene, which will enable them to live in a correct manner. This will result still more favorably in the increase in population. Along with such increase will come further and enforced economic development. With economic development will come more of the real pleasures of life. Through English will come a knowledge of fair play and a keen sense of honor, such as the progenitors of Americas had at the time of the origin of the language, and such as is practiced by the American nation at the present time. With the knowledge of English under American tutorship will come a natural love for labor and industry by those who even think who even come to think of themselves educated. A knowledge of theoretical as practical agriculture is open to all, and through English, under the present order of things, if continued, Guam should become one of the garden spots of the world. So this is often cited by historians as a text which represents sort of that racist motivation or those racialized assumptions that drove the US Navy in its policies. And so note here the idea that if you teach people to speak English, they'll do better economically. Now, this is not the argument. They're not making the argument that some people make where if you speak English, it opens opportunities for you. They are saying that knowledge of English will make you cleaner because you will understand sanitation and hygiene better, and that you will be able to live a better life because with English comes a knowledge of fair play and a sense of honor. So this in some way is what drove the US Navy. Not everybody at every level, but this text stands in and symbolizes what a lot of Americans at that time felt, which is that their language was special and unique, better than any others. And so advancing the Chamorro people meant compelling them to give up the way that they live, give up the way that they speak, and get them to speak our language instead, the English language instead. And so because of this, Chamorro children were punished for speaking their native language, their first language, and where for part of the time it was American, so white sort of Marines or sailors who were doing the punishing because they were the teachers. By the 1920s and 30s, it was primarily Chamorros who were doing the punishing of children in the schools for speaking English because they were the majority of teachers by then. And so let's kind of understand what it was like at that time. To be born into a world in which you go to school and you're told that school will give you the education you need, it'll make you smart. But the moment you get in there, you're told that whatever language you're speaking and that you come with is bad and you need to forget it and you need to not use it. What kind of contradictions in identity and in consciousness might that create? And so in his master's thesis about Chamorro language revitalization, Dr. Ken Gofagan Cooper recounts, interviews his grandmother, who was born before World War II and went to the pre-World War II school system. And he quotes her at length in terms of her experiences at that time. And gun kwento sa finotsumo tokahaw and guasalapetmo una pasi. If you get caught speaking Chamorro, if you have money, they make you pay. You have to pay. And gintadza muna fanyaw how muna fanyaw how blackboard muna fambali how gihiloy satgi. If you don't have any money, they make you clean the blackboard or they make you sweep the floor. And I pago me eskwela jugi first grade to tunguta naifum in English. When she first started first grade, she didn't know how to speak English. Sangan malago ju bayo kwentos debidi bayo finot Chamorro sa todo ichempo masasaw lekjo sa tadza salapehu. Unbiaya hutsuli isalapehu para semana at 5 centimos para soup sa matsuli todo gifinetna biyahi na hu kefu minut Chamorro. Pues na esta mapanisju niadzu mafanuidzu ni salapehu. And so she said, so in addition to sort of physical punishments, there was monetary fines. And so some children would bring lunch money to school, and if they were caught speaking Chamorro, they would end up having to pay their lunch money for the fine. And so she's describing that. And imagine that, if you have to go hungry for a week because you got caught speaking your native language, as if the language that you are born into and that your family uses at home, that it causes you so much distress, that it make you go hungry, that it make you be punished, called stupid. Edzigi angin eskwela some offense todu zagwasain eleknyaf English-speaking area. Purigaigi Americano gitano debita tungu ilenguania sa manyaska itano loangaigi ham gimat mami mem finut sa momoru ham todu champu ti mem finu Ingles ham. Angin malak eskwela how adzwa mem finu Ingles ham. Adzwi malagotnya ni parabay in tingu finu Ingles. And so for most Chamorros at this time, there is this divided existence. where you go to school and you switch off your Chamorro. And as you know, as Tanistela notes, there's signs there that remind you English-speaking area, English only here. And in fact, I remember interviewing Ike Tzatfris, Ignacio Tzatfris from the Tzatfris brothers, and he went to school right after the war. And he said that in the entire school in Agate that he went to when he was young, everything was in English except for the signs that told you don't speak Chamorro. The signs that told you that you should not speak Chamorro were in Chamorro, the only ones that he could remember on the whole campus. And so imagine today if you were put in a situation where the language that you were born into, you get punished, you get harassed. So many elders have told stories too about being spanked, having their fingers slapped or the backs of their legs slapped, made to wear a dunce cap, made to sit in the corner, made to wear a sign that said that they were stupid. All of these different things by different teachers, including most of whom eventually were Chamorro. All of these things just to kind of suppress the Chamorro language. One of the things that we should note, though, is that the suppression of Chamorro at that time, prior to World War II, did not work. Chamorros continued to speak their native language, and they were not raising children who could only speak English and not Chamorro. What happened is that by 1941, Guam was becoming functionally bilingual, that young children were speaking English and Chamorro. And that was good, except for the Navy. The Navy lamented that they were failing and that the people of Guam were harming themselves by refusing to give up their backwards primitive language. And so these plant the seeds. It's really World War II that changes everything. Because the Chamorro experience, as I like to say, and I wrote a master's thesis describing this, is that before World War II, the things that the US Navy said to Chamorros didn't necessarily believe it. Like if a US Navy officer or if somebody from the States told you that your language is useless, you should stop speaking it. Chamorros before the war didn't believe that. Instead, they said, yeah, whatever you say, Pari, but I want to know your language. I think it's good that my kids know your language, but we're not going to give up our language. What changes after World War II and the experience of Japanese oppression, domination, and also sort of a renewed and, a sort of a, I guess it's a changed relationship to the United States. That the United States then no longer is a colonizer, it becomes sort of a liberator. And so Chamorros come to believe in the words of the United States differently. So after the war, if somebody tells you stop speaking to your kids in Chamorro, Chamorros were much more willing to do that. And they did. They did that in huge numbers. And that's the story of how the Chamorro language disappears. And it took a little bit, but by the late 1960s, the first linguists identified that there were young Chamorros who couldn't speak their native language. And this was the first time ever. And it was in some ways a shocking thing to think that Chamorros, as far as we know, had been speaking their language for hundreds of generations. And then in the late 60s, you have the first children who can't speak their native language. And so for most people, they didn't notice it, or it became something that you just complain about, right? That you say, oh, the blame for it gets shifted onto the children, where so many parents after the war and up until today say, oh, the kids don't want to learn Chamorro, right? But instead, what we saw is that Chamorros had started to believe, whether unconsciously or consciously, the words of America, those colonizing words, and they had started to implement them in their lives, maybe not intentionally, but they had just started to segregate off themselves. So parents, elders who spoke Chamorro spoke it to each other. So we saw that there was still lots of Chamorro use within generations. But after World War II, there's a dramatic drop-off in transmission to the next generation. And that's what we see today. is that if you can speak Chamorro and you are 70 years old or 40 years old, chances are good that other people your age, you will speak Chamorro to them if you all can speak Chamorro. But there's almost no chance that you are speaking Chamorro to those younger than you. And that's the problem. And so in the 1970s, we see that there's the first concerted efforts to try to save the Chamorro language. And so we see there's Kolehun Mandikiki, which is the sort of the origins of the bilingual bicultural program, which still exists today in GDOE, for the first time, Chamorro children were taught formally in Chamorro, that it was not something that was done secretly. It was not something that was done as sort of to go around the rules, but now it was piloted and it was encouraged. And this is also a time when, after generations of suppression, the Guam legislature finally acknowledges that the Chamorro language is an official language alongside English on Guam. And so when people ask me sort of what can we do about this to save the Chamorro language, there's lots of things. Now, I don't know if the typhoon is going to knock out electricity for a while, and if it does, I might not have my Saturday Zoom class this weekend like I normally do. But if we do have it, the presentation, because this is my last class for the Fanyumakan, the dry season session, we're focusing on the roles that people can play in keeping the language alive. And sometimes people miss that, is that there's so many things that you can do. If you are an elder who speaks Chamorro and you spend a lot of time with with children, like your grandkids, speak Chamorro to them. Don't use the excuse that they don't want to learn. Who asked when they were young to learn specific languages? It doesn't work like that. Parents and families and communities give languages to youth that they feel are important. So the fact that people aren't using Chamorro with their children and grandchildren means that sort of the racist ideas of America won. They taught it to our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and our great-grandparents and grandparents may have resisted it for a little bit, but eventually they accepted it, took it to heart, and now the next generations are silent for Chamorro. Sa Timatungo, they don't know the language. And so if you ask me what you can do, if you can speak Chamorro, speak it to young children in particular, but speak it to others, and don't speak it in a way in which you just kind of put them down because they don't know it. Speak it patiently and wait. In the same way in which the U.S. Navy planted the seeds of our colonization, you can plant the seeds of our revitalization. All it takes is to use the Chamorro language, and with patience, keep using it and keep supporting those who are trying to learn. Si Zeus Masi podendo na question. All right, here we go. Imina hugwa na question. Number 2, what is a makana and what is the difference with a kakana or a surahanu? And so, who agradeces in a question? I appreciate this because recently I did do a Zoom lecture series which focused in on this. And so a lot of this was already fresh in my head. And so let's go back to 1602. What is a makana? Fray Juan Pobre, who was a lay Franciscan brother who lived in Roda for several months in the year 1602, wrote this about the makana. There are among them, the Chamorros, some Indios that are called makana, which means a man who can heal, who can make it rain, and who knows what the future holds. These makanas have many skulls in their houses and are more wont to talk with them than are other people. When the people of the village need water for their farmlands, they beseech these makanas to make it rain. And so what is the makana? The makana were, and people will interpret the sources on makana a little bit differently. For example, some people say they were healers. That was definitely part of it. They were healers. Some will say that they were like the witch doctors, shamans. What's clear from all the accounts about the makana is that they were the spiritual mediators and leaders for Chamorros, in that Chamorro religion at that time was ancestral veneration, ancestral worship, right? So you don't necessarily believe in a lot of big gods or stuff like that. Instead, the world, the spiritual world, your supernatural sort of beliefs are filled, is dominated by ideas that your ancestors are spirits around you, and that you have to live right and sort of in order to continue to get their protection and support. And so this picture here, for example, has has Chamorro women who are around a skull. So Chamorros would keep the skulls of their ancestors, and as long as they kept the bones of their ancestors safe, they believed that they had a connection, a spiritual connection to them. And so the Makana were those who worked with the spirits, could talk to the spirits, could get them to intervene on your behalf, to resolve disputes with your spirits, with your aniti, your ancestral spirits. And so that is, as far as we know, what Makana is. Now, when the Chamorro-Spanish Wars happen in the late 1600s, the Makana are one of the main targets, because the Spanish and the Jesuit priests seek to kind of claim the islands, take over. They are in charge now. And the Makana, with their sort of hold on the religion, is competition. Sort of, it's their antagonistic. It's their antagonist in this, right? And so the Makana is, of course, suppressed. Sort of the Spanish destroy bones of the ancestors of Chamorros. They try to outlaw practices. They forced Chamorros to attend church, and so on. And so the Makana, as they knew it at that time, comes to an end with the Chamorro-Spanish Wars. But the role of the Makana does not disappear. And so in the Faisen account from 1819, it says that the word for a healer is eamtis, right? And or o, the prefix, when put in front of a word, means to look for it. So eamti is to look for a way to treat somebody or cure somebody. And so the Makana doesn't disappear, right? This is colonization brings about tragic, violent changes, but it scarcely ever leads to everything disappearing and being completely replaced. Instead, there's a negotiation that takes place. There's forms of adaptation or hybridity, and then sort of new feelings of normality and identity emerge from that. And so in one of my articles for Guampedia, I wrote that the religion and beliefs that the Makanas represented, namely ancestor veneration, the idea that the landscape of Guam was populated by spirits of deceased Chamorros, it did not disappear when the Spanish won their war. The public figure of the Makana did disappear, as the Spanish publicly outlawed and condemned the former religion of the Chamorros, but the beliefs of in the persistence of Chamorro spirits remained and were supported by the Makanas as intermediaries between the living and their ancestral spirits, was transferred onto another public figure, that of the medicinal healer. And so the Makana does not completely disappear, but instead outwardly, they cannot perform the same function. So instead, they privately continue to act as the mediator between the living and the dead, Chamorros and their ancestral spirits, or Chamorros in the spiritual world. But publicly, their role is healers. And this is part of a larger evolution of Chamorro culture that takes place at this time. Where, and so in the article that I just referenced, for example, I say that Gualo becomes Lanso, Guput becomes Fiesta, Aniti becomes Tautamotna, Makana becomes Surahanu, and the Magahaga becomes Santa Maria. And so some of these are cleaner than others, but this idea of continuity in culture is key, because sometimes people will use the idea of authenticity, that culture is lost, it changes, it disappears, it's lost, it becomes inauthentic. And this is something that we feel. It's very common. We feel this, right? That something's not authentic, it's not right, it's not real, it's not true. The problem, though, is that when you look at culture and human communities, authenticity is not sort of the way that we live, right? That culture is always there and it's always changing and shifting, and it's never as simple as the way that we speak and wish it would be. And so that's why this chart is a good one for helping us understand how Chamorro identity culture wasn't lost, but it did become transformed in some ways, right? So that Chamorros farmed before the war, or before the Spanish Chamorro War, they continued to farm after, but they might farm in different ways. They might farm in different areas. The identity around it might shift, but you can still see some continuity, right? And so culture is a difficult thing to talk about because on the one hand, we feel like it should always be the same and stay a certain way for it to be real, but it is always also changing constantly. But this can help us kind of understand that a little bit more, is that the Makana changes, but the role is still there. So this is one of the better ways that anthropologists can talk about culture and identity, is through continuity, not authenticity, but continuity. So I'm excited to share this though, because this is about more than 100 years ago, about 100 and let's say 4 years ago. I'm going to share with you 2 short essays that were written by young Chamorro women who were attending the teaching school under the US Navy. And so the Surahanu, but there's also something called the Kakana, right? Makanas, but then the Kakana. And so these were written by 2, as I said, young Chamorro women who were training to become teachers. And this is what they said about Kakana. Kakana is the name applied to the person who works mischief toward other people. When a father or mother is Kakana, all the children and grandchildren will be Mankakana until the last generation. The Kakana can perform different kinds of tricks on people. The instruments of the Kakana are 2 thigh or forearm bones, 1 rag doll, 1 pin, and 1 big lizard, 1 coconut oil lamp and trunk. The Kakana first puts the 2 bones crosswise in the bottom of the trunk, then the rag doll above them, and the lizard to play around in these things. He keeps the oil lit in his trunk at all times. Now, if somebody makes the Kakana mad, he will certainly cause the person some injury. If he wants his enemy to have sore eyes, he gets the pin and sticks it into the doll's eyes. Whenever he wants some part of the enemy's body to have a wound or sickness, he just sticks the pin into the part of the doll where he wants the injury to be, and his enemy will get it. And so, this sounds a little bit like voodoo. And so, fascinating. Let's go to the next one, and then we're going to talk about these. Okay. And then, so Rosalie Franquez, who wrote this, then continues, when the Mankakana enemy suffers from disease, he seeks out the Kakana to ask for a pardon and to heal the wound. Once a pardon is given, the wound heals in a few days and sometimes instantly. Many who believe in the Mankakana are very afraid to make them mad because they might make them sick. When the Kakana asks you for something, you must give him what he wants, or something bad will happen to you. If you say bad things to the Kakana, your mouth will ache. If you pinch the Kakana, your hands will be paralyzed. Okay, here's the next one. This is by Emilia Martinez. Another student gave much of this. So the teacher wrote about Emilia Martinez's essay. Another student gave much of the same general story of the Kakana, except she mentioned that there were more of them in Agate than anywhere else, and she held that they were all old women. She also said they kept their implements in an earthenware jar with a cover hidden in a safe place. Once a Kakana broke her jar, her power vanished. She said a safety pin fastened to the door curtain of a home would render the Kakana harmless. She said that the Kakana doll was made out of certain spongy wood, and long lemonchina thorns were used to stick into it. Now, the Kakana is something that some of you might be familiar with, but many of you might not be familiar with it. You may be more familiar with the Surahanu, right? Is that the Makana becomes outwardly the Surahanu. So this is from Laura Thompson and her book, Guam and Its People, which was a study of Guam and the Chamorro people from the late 1930s. She spent several months on Guam interviewing Chamorros. And so she wrote about the Surahanu, that they are a class of professional herb doctors there's a class of professional herb doctors called the Surahana. They still survive in Guam. The Surahana consists mainly of women over 50. They practice their ancient art of healing in secret. They even did so in the heart of Agana. There are 3 or 4 who are well known to the local natives in every village. Some are famous for their art throughout the island, but their names and activities are carefully guarded from the government authorities, who in their efforts to introduce Western medical practices are trying to stamp out the native art as quickly as possible. And so what I find fascinating about the Makana and how it becomes the Surahanu is that it is this position that changes in response to colonial forces. So the Surahanu emerges initially because of Spanish suppression after the Chamorro-Spanish Wars. But even though the Surahanu is out there and part of the community, they still do things in secret. And part of the reason is because some Surahanus also engage in kakana arts, where they cast spells, where they can hurt people, where they can use their connection to the spirits to gather information, to spy on others, right? And so the Surahanu is okay to be out there publicly. But for the longest time, but the kakana was still part of it. But one thing that we've seen, and I do want to note, though, that the kakana stories here, some of them may be kind of fanciful. These were teenage girls and boys who were going to school, and they wrote essays on behalf of their teacher, Helen Paul, and they might have made things up at times. They might have embellished. They were just sharing funny or interesting or spooky things from their folklore. But there's enough here, if you're familiar with this, there's enough here to know that this is based in something. But the kakana was not something that you talked about. And the Surahanu, and so what we see in the 20th century is that the kakana kind of completely starts to disappear. One of the main things sort of that distinguishes the kakana from a Surahanu is sort of outwardly their relationship to the religion, Catholicism. And that it was believed that somebody who is kakana has to turn their back on Christian religion, that they weren't allowed to go to church, that they would have to stand outside the church while their family went to church, that they couldn't touch a cross, right? That because of their connection to the ancient spirits, they had to give up being connected to the community of faith, the Catholic community of faith. And so what we see is the Surahanu eventually kind of becoming the dominant, the healing aspect, less the spiritual aspect. And what we see, for example, in the 20th century is another big shift, which always fascinates me, is that if you had tried to ask Chamorros 100 or 200 years ago where they get the power to heal, they would probably say nothing. They wouldn't answer your questions because of the secreted nature of it. But it was clear that people believed that they get their power from the Aniti, from the spirits, the Tautomotna. But what we see in the 20th century is that the Surahanu and Surahana begin to describe their power as coming from God or angels, the Virgin Mary. Tun Juan Cepeda, who was one of the most famous Surahanos in Guam in the 20th century, there was even a documentary made about him. I'm a pain doctor. He, literally felt that he learned the basics for how to work with plants from an old Surahanu from agate called Manuel Tzatfres. But then he was blessed by the Virgin Mary, who gave him even more powers to heal, in addition to just mixing plants and making some amut taiguanao. And so this is, for me, this is what makes all of this very fascinating, is that this position has existed since ancient times and it shifts and it changes as CHamoru's change and in response to things around us. And so, but so when people ask me, what does Makana mean? And it's important because my new child, which I don't know if you can hear, he's just 2 weeks old now. His name is Makana. And a few generations ago, people would have never named their child Makana because it had those types of ancient spirit, bad spirit, especially, CHamoru, it had those connotations of CHamoru's understanding their past through Catholicism, that these are evil spirits, the Tautamona, they're bad, right? The Makana are bad. But nowadays, as things get more opened up, it becomes okay. So for me, Makana simply means somebody who has the ability to use powers, whether they can cast spells, whether they can heal, but it's believed, of course, because of the root word kana, which possibly has connections to other Austronesian words about energy or life force, power. And so a Makana is somebody who has power. And so the Makana is still around in some way, right? The position that they represented in life did not disappear. But as the world changes, as the island changes, as CHamoru's change, so too does that position. And so too, interestingly, as I've mentioned, does the identity of the Makana themselves, the Surahanus themselves, or the Zoamti themselves, is that how they see their own art also changes. All right, estige y último. This is our last question, because biao asanganidzo na esto uutsan gisanhidzon, esto humilangit. We're getting closer and closer to condition 1. The celebration of Liberation Day never seemed right to me, with us still being a territory. Have there been efforts to challenge the meaning of this holiday in the past? Again, this is a very interesting question to me, because Liberation Day is something which, for some people, it's considered to be kind of almost a sacred day because of its connection to our history. For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, Liberation Day commemorates the end of the Japanese occupation of Guam in World War II, when the U.S. It is celebrated on July 21st of every year, because that's the day that the U.S. began their reinvasion of Guam to take the island back from the Japanese. And so, as part of Liberation Day, there's a carnival, there's a huge parade. There's lots of parties and gatherings. It's the time when many people who live off island come home. And for a while, it was also a time when people who had participated in the U.S. reinvasion and retaking of the island, its liberation from the Japanese, where they would come back to see the island again and how it's changed, and also be honored by the community. And so Liberation Day has definitely been challenged, although part of the interesting thing in this story, though, is that it has been challenged and it has changed, and sometimes it, like anything, changes because of how it's challenged, and sometimes it changes just because the community has changed. And so let's start off with what the first Liberation Day was like. The first Liberation Day, which was 1945, was very different than every Liberation Day since. There was small festivities sort of by the U.S. Navy. You can see here Tan Agata Johnston, who was one of the people who helped formalize Liberation Day, cutting a cake here with a U.S. Navy officer. The main sort of feature of that first liberation was a luau, a procession, in which people marched in a very solemn Catholic religious style, and there was a mass, and there was sort of a, like a fiesta, but it was almost completely within a Catholic religious context, that it was done in honor of those who had died in the war. And so the first Liberation Day was very different. It was a solemn occasion. Liberation Day changed dramatically within just a year or two, and then within 10 years, it was completely different. For a long time, it was focused heavily on the U.S. military, marching, sort of in uniform, driving their trucks and vehicles down Marine Drive. Eventually, sort of it became a civic thing where different community organizations or even businesses would have floats in the parade as well. And now it has become even much more community-based, where there is absolutely still a military component, but the most visible aspects of it are often the mayors who create floats, or village, different village floats, or GovGuam agencies which create floats, right? And so the military is still there, but Liberation Day has become much more of a community event. A community event. It reflects sort of the complicated nature of Guam, where the U.S. military and militarization is a huge part of it, but also sort of the GVB, CHamoru culture, sort of showcasing our island's beauty and community aspect is also there as well. And so the first kind of public challenges to Liberation Day happen in newspapers, interestingly enough. Sometimes letters to the editor, and sometimes through advertisements. So, for example, these are two advertisements which are talking about what is the real meaning of Liberation Day, or how can we call it a liberation when we still remain a colony of the United States or a territory of the United States. And so, as you can see from here on the right, this is Organization of People for Indigenous Rights, which had members such as Robert Underwood, Bennett Dunca, Rosa Salas Palomo, Hope Cristobal, Chris Perez, Howard, Ron Tihan, Maria Tihan, and so on. Komagahit naman libre hit. Are we truly free? Imagahit na linibre syempre ufato gid sa hita kumagaygi destinuta gikanaita. The real freedom will surely come to us if our destiny is in our hands. Destiki matutuan ikinalamtan gubet gid sa guahan tads and appropriate na tataw tanoniha dumisidi hafa pari utimunya yesla. And so here it's highlighting that just the fact that the Chamorro people have never been asked sort of what they want for the future of their island. And as you can see here, connecting Liberation Day, right? Because for some people, they feel that Liberation Day is like the end of history, that everything's great and wonderful and fine now. But in truth, Liberation Day did not end Guam's political development, and certainly not our colonial story. It took more than 20 years after Liberation Day until Guam was allowed to elect a governor. And so, no, Liberation Day didn't end anything. It improved our situation. People can definitely be grateful for the end of the Japanese occupation. But in terms of our political struggle, our continuing quest for decolonization, Liberation Day doesn't end anything. And so one of the first main ways that Liberation Day kind of was used as a vehicle for instilling a critical consciousness was with groups, grassroots organizations, activist groups, who'd used it as a chance to release messages connecting the history to our present, right? The idea that the true liberation awaits us. The group Nation Chamorro was created on Liberation Day in Laddystone Park. Angel Santos and others gathered, about 20 other people gathered amongst the Lati that are there, and they formally created, while the parade was happening on the other side, sort of a group which was meant to represent the Chamorro nation. And so the symbolism of Liberation Day is important too, as being a chance to counter things, right? To try to use it to amplify a message. And so that was definitely the intent with Nation Chamorro forming themselves on this day at a time when people might turn off their critical thinking because they think that Liberation Day should just be about waving the American flag and being grateful for what America has done to Guam. Angel Santos and others gathered to say, let's remember who we are. Let's remember sort of all the problems that we face, that our history doesn't begin and end with the United States. There have been demonstrations within Liberation Day. And so Nation CHamoru has marched in Liberation Day and in the Liberation Day parade with signs, with flags. This is from 2010 when a group of Chamorro language and social work students at the University of Guam marched in protest in support of Chamorro language, Chamorro rights, with a huge flag that belonged to the late John Gerber. And so people have absolutely used the parade itself to represent sort of an issue that they care about. And more recently, the Commission on Decolonization and Political Status task forces have used the parade to do outreach, to try to pass out information about our current political status and how our political status could change or could become different if we were to decolonize. And so some of the messages of the Commission on Decolonization, true liberation is decolonization, are important for us to remember. As Ben Blas, who was a World War II survivor, he was a Chamorro, the first, an early Chamorro to serve in the U.S. Marines and the first non-white person to become a brigadier general in the U.S. Marines. You know, he made the connection that the quest continues for the Chamorro people, that true liberation lies ahead through self-determination. And many others, such as OPIR, such as the Commission on Decolonization, also make that connection, is that true liberation means changing our political status so that we are no longer a territory. And so Liberation Day, and so I didn't have time to, but I was going to make one more slide, because one of the most interesting things in this story, though, is that in the 1980s, Governor Ricky Berdallo became sort of he made one of the first attempts to try to explicitly change Liberation Day. And so some of you who are older, you may remember Fiesta en Guam, that part of it was that Liberation Day was still there, still celebrated, but to change the focus of it so that it is a time for Guam to celebrate itself, not the same thing as kind of just we celebrate and we bow down to the US military, which some people had felt it had been before. So one of the most interesting things about that is that Fiesta en Guam only lasted for a few years. It was not something that was particularly popular in terms of changing the name of it. But what Ricky Berdallo and others hoped for did happen. It eventually did happen, in that the Liberation Day parade it's still called Liberation Day, but it now is much more about representing the community versus only kind of thanking the military for what they've done. All right. Enoha Parapago, Manadzen, Sidus Masi. It is May and it is Museum Month. And Hutsotsogo este pago sa zahonay na be celebragi este na manera masya didinay este na importante na mes. I've done this live stream today, bringing back Faisen Guam Museum after almost a year since we've last done it, just as a way to celebrate Museum Month. Because the Guam Museum being temporarily closed for the fixing of our aircon, we haven't been able to do as much for Museum Month, and now we have a typhoon which is bearing down on the island. But Museum Month is a time when museums around the world celebrate and remind the community about the value of museums. We hold on to the treasures of the past. And when I say treasures, I don't mean that we hold on to priceless, expensive things. I mean that we hold on to the things from our past that we need to preserve so that we can remember that past. And they can be everyday items, they can be fancy, expensive things, but museums hold on to those treasures so that we can remain connected to that past, so that we can continue to tell our story. And so if you have a question, comment with it. You can email me or you can send it on social media. For the next Faisen Guam Museum, si Zeus Masinu Hamzu Todos Aide Huhungo ki Itzan Edzgi Pakzo. All right. Adios. Este ki manatli hitatlo. Nafensosofo Hamzu. Ni Manyasiga Guinigi Islas Marianas.